How are you, sir?
How are you? Well, good morning, everybody. We are starting off in the book of James. Go ahead and jump up to that. It's a brand new class, brand new quarter, brand new me, brand new everything. It's just brand new all the stuff. So we're going to look at James chapter 1, and we are going to take it. We'll talk about it a little bit more here in a second. We're going to take it in a little bit different format than probably normally do. This is a letter. This is, as I mentioned, I think a few times, I had something completely different planned. I actually had a two-quarter section planned on a harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and I'm sure everybody was really excited about that. But the survey said everybody wanted to do James, so we moved that. We're doing James now. We'll do Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles next quarter. We'll kind of compress that a little bit. But this is one of those books that everyone, as we'll talk about this morning, everyone thinks is very simple. And hopefully as we go through this quarter, we'll find out that it is simple to understand. It's simple to kind of get a grasp of what he's talking about, but not so much in terms of application. And there's a lot of depth to James that we sometimes don't think about very much. So hopefully throughout this quarter, we'll kind of get a new appreciation for it. Before we begin, though, I'm going to ask Mr. Joe Kerr, if he doesn't mind, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day, first day of the week, for this opportunity that we have this morning to assemble, gather, and study the words of your name. We pray that our hearts and our minds will be receptive this morning as we're about to enter this worship service. Pray, Father, that you will watch over and protect each of us and everything that we say and do. We pray, Father, that your continued blessings will be upon those of our number who have been sick. We're thankful for those who have now been sick, who have recovered. We pray, Father, that you be with those of our number who are traveling. Give them a safe journey to their destination and back home again. We ask, Father, that you guide, guard, and direct us throughout this life. Forgive us of our sins and help us to be worthy of these things with us in Christ.
Amen. Thank you. So I mentioned last week, we're going to be out of town on this Wednesday and Sunday. So we're going to kind of start, if you were here last Wednesday, we're going to kind of start the quarter, and then we'll just kind of take a brief break. But next Sunday morning, Cody Crumpton is going to be leading us in our Bible class, and then Dustin is going to be doing the sermon. I feel bad because I asked Cody right around the whole time that the eldership stuff was going on, so I didn't mean to make him feel guilty like he had to, but he was very gracious and looking forward to it. So I wish, that's the bad side about leaving, is I wish I could hear what he has to say. I'm sure it'll be great. But we'll start off with that. I hope we're doing that next week, and then we'll pick up more with James chapter 1 next week. What I wanted to do this week is just kind of do an overview. And this is something we'll do this morning, and we'll do at the very end of the class, because James is it's not a short book by any stretch of the imagination. 5.5 chapters is not really a tiny book, but there's a lot to it, and a lot of it's stuff that we've kind of gone over. But the approach that we're taking this quarter is a little bit different. That's what I wanted to talk about kind of before we go any further, is how this class is going to work. Most of us have read James probably 1,000 times. You know, probably if I were to ask you what are the main themes, you probably understand what the themes are, as we'll discuss here in a second. And so James is one of those books that we kind of revisit, we kind of look at it, we move on to something else. But there's a lot of depth to it, and I wanted to kind of take a different approach. When I was looking up material and kind of reading it a few times to kind of get a grasp on what we're talking about, it appeared to me, and you may completely disagree with me, and there's nothing doctrinal about this necessarily, one way or the other, but it seems to me that when you read James chapter 1, it kind of acts as a summary for the entire book. It seems like James kind of summarizes everything that he talks about. Whether that was intentional, whether that was accidental, I don't really know. But that's how it at least appeared to me. And so the way that we're going to take this class with this quarter is we're going to take a few verses from James chapter 1 and look at its corresponding section later. So this morning, or 2 weeks from now, for instance, we'll look at James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, and we'll finish off with James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11. But when you look at James chapter 1, for instance, and this is the very beginning, this is how James opens up everything. This is one of the more kind of well-known sections of the book of James. He says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." We'll talk about this section a little bit more in 2 weeks, but what is James gravitating towards in those 3 verses? We'll talk about how much fun it is, by the way, in 2 weeks to go through various trials. That's obviously what he had in mind. Right, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's kind of the big nebulous idea. But right, there's this idea of growth through perseverance, growth through struggles, growth through trials. Yeah. When you look at James chapter 5, for instance, it seems like he revisits this theme. And James 1, 2 through 4, and James 5, 7 through 11 kind of act as a nice little bookends for this entire book. When you look at James chapter 5, starting in verse 7, he says, "Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and late rains. We'll discuss that in 2 weeks as well, that idea of the early and late rains. You too be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord, and count those blessed who endured. You have heard the endurance of Job, and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. What is he talking about in James chapter 5, 7 through 11? Yeah, patience is a part of it, yeah. Patience is part of it. What else is he talking about? Right, don't grow weary waiting for that day to come. Yeah. Right, stay positive, kind of look through the day and look towards, kind of the end results of your faith. What three people does he bring up in James 5, 7 through 11? And this is just kind of an example of how we're going to take this class. Job is the big one. Job is the one that everybody sees first and foremost. Who else does he bring up? Right, farmers and the prophets. All three of these different individuals are examples of perseverance. And so when you look at James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, for instance, and he talks about encountering various trials and the testing of your faith producing endurance, and a lot of this sounds very Paul-esque in nature. He talks about kind of the result of that endurance, and he uses in James chapter 5 these three people as kind of examples for that. And so, in my opinion, when you look at these two sections of Scripture, they go very well together. And we'll do that kind of throughout the course of this entire quarter. We'll then end up, in a few weeks, we'll talk about James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, and then at the end of the quarter, we'll look at verse 26 by itself, and then verse 27 by itself. But it seems like James chapter 1 kind of operates as a summary for all of this. I may be way off on that, and by the time we get 4 weeks into it, it may just go completely haywire, but if nothing else, it'll at least be kind of a different approach to it. Somebody have any thoughts or comments on that? I'm not big on word, verse-by-verse studies, although if you want to be honest, James chapter 1 is a great book to kind of do a word study, verse-by-verse study. Let me ask you this, what are some of the big themes in the book of James?
Humility.
Humility is one, for sure, yeah. In a lot of different areas, not just the one that we kind of commonly describe. Yeah. Faith and works, you got that from the title slide. Well, not there, but it was on the title slide. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I knew you weren't really looking. Faith and works, that relationship, and that's another thing. I mean, if you look at James, that's the one everybody goes towards, is faith and works, that relationship, and you could spend years discussing its kind of marriage with Paul's idea of faith and works, yeah. The tongue is a big one, James chapter 3. What else are some of these things?
Talk about the rich.
The rich, exactly. And that's one thing that we don't really look at. When we look at the book of James, the big one that everybody jumps to, that I always jump to, is this idea of perseverance. I don't think that's inaccurate at all. I think James begins, I think he ends the book of James talking about endurance. So it's not a disservice to the text to say that the big theme of the book of James is perseverance. But there's a whole bunch of other things he talks about. For instance, he talks about prayer, the necessity of prayer. I think you see that especially in James chapter 5. But you also see this idea of money. And this will be probably our biggest class we'll discuss, not in terms of fireworks shows or anything like that, but big in terms of we're going to be covering a lot of material in the book of James about the idea of money. What attitude does Paul or does James have towards money? What things does he talk about? Or wealth, socioeconomic status. What kind of things does he say about it? Right, how you use it. Or even also how you misuse it. Right. Right, how you deal with people who have it, how you deal with people who don't have it, and the relationship between the two. And that's not something that's just kind of unique to them. Do we still struggle with this idea of people who have a lot of money and people who don't have a lot of money, that relationship between those? I think we do. I don't think that's a unique problem in James' day. I don't think that's a unique problem here. Not here, but in today's world. I think that's just a problem that people have had for years. When you look at James chapter 5, for instance, you look at verse 1, he really goes into some really strong kind of words. He doesn't just mince words. And that's, to me, when you look at James, he almost gets progressively more intense throughout the book. And then by the time you get to James chapter 5, he just really lets people have it. James chapter 5, starting in verse 1, he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts on your slaughter. You have condemned and put to death a righteous man. He does not resist you. Would you say that James is using strong language, or do you think he's just kind of milk-toast?
Pretty strong.
It's rather strong, exactly. Why do you think he's so animated when he talks about this? Why do you think he's so intense when he discusses the idea of riches and the relationship? Yeah.
What he's addressing here, by and large, is people that have gotten their riches ill-gotten and have been hard on poor people and have robbed the poor people that work for them.
Yeah, some of it is ill-gotten gain, and that's certainly in view when you look at James 5. He also talks, and you can put the first part of James 2 in view of this when he kind of describes a relationship, how you're just kind of withholding that from people who you know need it, and that's a whole conversation we'll discuss in a few weeks. Howard? Oh, okay, I thought I saw your hand, yeah. Oh, okay. Go ahead. Okay, Joe, go ahead.
Allah's blessings of, material blessings to the Israelites.
Right.
And they were walking in his ways. And so that really became very much ingrained into their thinking about, if I'm doing well, it's because, God thinks I'm
Yeah. Which isn't a belief just relegated 2,000 years ago. People still believe, at least in some ways, that if I'm walking with God, God will bless me. Of course, we could talk about 300 different televangelists who believe that. But yeah, there still is that idea that if I'm blessed, then God must obviously love me. I think that's a little bit here too. Yeah, Joe?
We also have to consider that all of his writings, for the most part, they were all poor back then.
Yeah.
But you did have that select group of rich folks. And you need to emphasize to them that you're the guy.
Yeah, that's true. I hate to say that all of them were poor back then, but I know exactly what you mean. It's a different wealth distribution we have in today's world. If you look at charts of wealth distribution today versus them, you look 2,000 years ago, it goes like this, and then it goes sharply up. So there's a lot of wealth that's concentrated in the Empire of Rome within a very smaller amount of people, whereas today it's a little bit more kind of flat. And so there is this idea. 100 years ago, this was a huge topic. James chapter 5, the first 5 verses was used. If you're familiar with the muckrakers, if you're familiar with Emmett Goldman, the anarchists, these were verses that were used to talk about the working conditions of the poor, working conditions of the common man in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. And so this idea of wealth distribution is not so much prevalent in today's world because it's a little bit different than it is, but it's still something that we need to be aware of. But when you look at James 5, the first 5 verses, that's very strong, powerful language that almost sounds anarchist in nature. I mean, it's very, we need to, if you're rich and powerful and you're looking down at your brother and you're withholding it from them, your day of judgment is coming. He doesn't mince words on that. And then you look at John in 1 John chapter 3, verse 15, and he calls people who hate their brother what? He says, if you see your brother in need of goods and you withhold your heart from them, you are what? Anybody remember? Starts with an M. Murderer, yeah, I can never say that because there's too many R's. Yes, you are a murderer. So there's a strong language in John, there's strong language here, but it all kind of falls in the purview of the city of Jerusalem. If James is, and this is something we'll discuss toward the end of this, but if James is indeed writing this from the city of Jerusalem, what was the early church like? If you're looking 20 years post-Pentecost, the city of Jerusalem, what was the city of Jerusalem like? What were the people like around the day of Pentecost? When everybody became Christians, what did they do? Acts chapter 2 talks about this. They shared with one another.
A lot of them were basically displaced at that time.
Right.
They're not in their own, a lot of them were not in their own countries.
That's true, yeah. A lot of them were kind of there as travelers for these days. I don't think necessarily that's who he's talking about. I think he's talking about just Christians that happen to be in Jerusalem that kind of formed this little community. But you see that wealth distribution happening in Acts chapter 2, where everybody sees needs and they kind of fill it because of that. Yeah. And so apparently by the time you get to James writing this in James chapter 5, either something has changed or there's still some kind of an attitude of selfishness. And so he's writing to directly combat that idea that had kind of, I guess, gone by the wayside. He also talks, and this is what Joe mentioned earlier, he talks about faith and works, this relationship. What is the relationship between faith and works according to James? preaching that in 2019, and you're going to have a bunch of people that will get mad at you. Right, faith is the engine, what works is the evidence of it, and that's James chapter 2 kind of in a nutshell. Yeah.
Bob, I have is a subheading, and I'm used to being saying something that not really real.
And you can never trust subheadings.
But this one has faith without works is dead.
Right.
That's what the translated.
Yeah.
No question about it.
Right. Of course, he's pulling, whoever wrote that subheading is pulling it directly from the verses below that, because James immediately says faith without works is dead. And then you have the Hebrew writer mentioning, a shipwrecked faith, and or maybe that's Paul talks about Timothy. But there's this idea of faith that is different than sometimes what people in today's world think. They think of it, if I have faith, then I'm automatically saved. Well, that's not true. You can have a dead faith, you can have a shipwrecked faith, you can have a whole bunch of different types of faith. But faith without any kind of action is dead. And so the way that you reconcile that with what Paul says, that's what kind of throws people into a little bit of a tizzy. You also have the idea of speech coming into play. This is James chapter 3, the first 10 verses. That to me is one of the more interesting sections in the book of James, because he says, from the mouth, both good things and bad things come out. And the way he characterizes that, the way he describes it in terms of a fountain, I think is very interesting. And so the idea that he's going towards there is, there can be bad things that proceed out of your mouth. Evil, slurs, and anger, and hatred. But that same thing can also produce happiness, and joy, and peace, and words of encouragement. And so the idea is that you need to kind of keep your mouth in check so that your religion isn't worthless. And that's also what he mentions at the end of chapter 1. And that's where you can see kind of these correlating parts that seem to go together. Of course, the idea of people working together is a big part of that. To me, one of the biggest themes that we never talk about in the book of James is this idea of perfection. If you look at James chapter 2, for instance, James chapter 1, verse 4, James chapter 2, verse 2, he discusses this idea of perfection a couple of different times. In James chapter 2 and verse 22, actually, for instance. James chapter 2 and verse 22, he says, you see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected, which and the scripture was fulfilled, which says that Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. When you look at James chapter 1 and verse 4, he says, let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. This is another idea that's very similar to Paul. Paul would say in Colossians chapter 1, his whole goal is to make every man perfect in Jesus Christ. What does he mean when he says perfect?
Complete.
Complete. You were really quick on that trigger, exactly. What does it mean when he says complete? I'll see your answer and raise you another question. What does it mean for somebody to be complete?
You lack nothing, you have everything spiritual.
Right, as close to Jesus as we can be, so there's this idea of similarity between them. I know, I was getting the lead. Yeah, I try to ignore him as much as possible. Sometimes he just says stuff. Yeah. Go ahead, what would you say? That's fine. I can live longer than you can.
You lack nothing. You have everything complete to live a spiritual life.
Right, exactly. And that's one of these themes that James really hits on. And that's why when you look at these different themes that he talks about perseverance and prayer, it seems almost just kind of like a scattershot of all the greatest hits of the New Testament. And that's the way James seems to appear to a lot of us. Well, why does he talk about prayer? Why does he talk about the tongue? Why does he talk about faith? Why does he talk about money? Why does he talk about it's in 5 chapters, he takes basically the entire New Testament and crams it into 5 chapters. But the idea of it, at least in my opinion, is that idea of perfection. I'm trying to create in somebody, James says, the perfect Christian, so that there's this idea of completeness. You know what you're supposed to do. You have the tools designed to do it. So when we go through the book of James, that's what I want you to stick in your mind, is this idea of completion, this idea of perfection, because that to me is what James is really trying to drive towards. Anybody have any thoughts on that real quick?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the relationship with Christ. And ultimately, that is our aim, our goal. It's not even to have the right tools. It's not. Those help us to what end? To make sure that that relationship with Christ remains intact throughout any event or circumstance you may find in life.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a rich brother or a poor brother. How do you maintain the relationship with Christ?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it handles that approach. Your speech. How do you make sure that relationship with Christ is always intact? And if that is always true, then you are complete. You're ready to go at any point.
Yeah, exactly. And that's and what he represents here, and there's a lot of reasons why this is a great class to kind of go after our discipleship class, Because what he's talking about is not a checklist type of stuff. What James is addressing is not, do this on the first day of the week, do this before you eat, just sit and kind of endure the persecution. That's not what he's getting at. He's trying to create the individual that has a good natural response to these types of world events that just seems to be who you are. So he's not saying, he's not trying to just give us a checklist worth of stuff that we just kind of need to keep and be neurotic about. He's trying to craft the perfect person. And when I say perfect, I mean complete, one who looks like Christ in as many possible kind of versions, in many different types of ways as we can. Shall we say? Anybody else have any thoughts or comments? By the way, I know there's lots of people, because there were 6 people that suggested James, and I know there's people that have looked at James, so I expect you to speak up throughout the course of this quarter, or else me and you, actually it was anonymous, so I don't know who it was, but I know there are people that can't talk about it, so feel free to bring it up. One of the things also that is touched on a lot in the book of James is this idea of Old Testament, New Testament ethics. And we talked a second ago about how James kind of takes all these different things and embodies them into the idea of perfect Christian. But what he also does is he takes things from the Old Testament, he puts them in New Testament context and applies them to us. One of the best examples that he does, and we'll talk about this for a couple minutes, one of the best things he does is, for instance, he looks at Deuteronomy chapter 6. What does Deuteronomy chapter 6 talk about? Does anyone remember? Verses 4 through 6, it's called the Shema. Does anybody remember?
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Right. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. That's something that, and Deuteronomy has a lot of stuff to it, but the Jews were very emphatic that this was something that you had to say pretty much when you got up, pretty much when you bed. That was the core of their belief. The Lord is God, the Lord is one. But then you jump over to Matthew chapter 22, and Jesus is asked the question, what do you believe the greatest commandment in the law is? And what does Jesus say? Well, that's the second one. What is the first one he says? Right. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. What Jesus does is he takes Deuteronomy chapter 6, applies it in a New Testament context, but then he says what Howard mentioned, which is what? You shall also, right, you shall also love your neighbor as yourself. So what he did was Jesus took Deuteronomy chapter 6, put a secondary thing on it, kind of a parallel with it. And then what James does when you get to James chapter 2, for instance, is he takes that same idea that they were familiar with, the idea of the Lord is God, the Lord is one, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and then he kind of puts it in New Testament, kind of very specific New Testament types of language. He says in verse 8, if however you are fulfilling the royal law according to Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing well. That's not the royal law according to the Old Testament standards. What is that the royal law according to? According to Christ, exactly. So it's not an Old Testament type of thing, but the idea is there in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Jesus builds on it in Matthew chapter 22, and then James brings that into full view in James chapter 2, verse 8. So throughout the course of the book of James, you'll see these types of fulfillments where James takes these Old Testament principles, these New Testament principles, and he kind of applies them in different scenarios and different formats. Of course, James chapter 2, verse 8 is about the idea of brotherly love and how people go together, people work together. You see this in a couple more places. For instance, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 34 and 37, this is the Sermon on the Mount. But Jesus says, but I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. No. Anything beyond these is of evil. Matthew chapter 5, verses 34 and 37 is pretty simple. We've probably read that 1,000 times. James says almost the exact same thing in James chapter 5, verse 12, when he says, but above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but your yes is to be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall into judgment. It is almost an exact representation of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. And this is the type of stuff, when we talked about earlier, that you've read James 1,000 times, we're familiar with it, that just kind of fly under the radar, that we don't notice what James is doing. He does a very similar type of thing, Matthew chapter 21 and 21, where Jesus answered and says to them, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig trees, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen. What does that sound a lot like in James? He does it right at the beginning of the book of James, first chapter of Matthew. What did you say? Well, that's not the Sermon on the Mount. The one previous to that was. But James takes this section. I think Zach had it.
He says, those that ask in faith, not doubt, they're the ones that are going to receive what they need from heaven. But
right.
If you have a double-sided mind, or that's the idea.
Yeah. No, you're right, yeah. In James chapter 1 and verse 6 is almost an exact representation. There's a little bit of variation. But he says, he who must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. You even have the sea metaphor that James kind of accommodates for himself. But James is basically taking these statements of Jesus and the teachings that Jesus had talked about, teachings in the Old Testament, and he's bringing them to their logical fulfillment throughout the book of James. And to me, that's very, very powerful to kind of talk about the application of us 2,000 years later. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on that? I'm asking for thoughts and comments because I need to cough. I don't know if you can't tell, my allergies are not feeling well today. Go ahead.
I'm thinking about the scripture that said that
No, you're right. That happens to me every Sunday morning. I feel bad. Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments? Let's ask the billion-dollar question. This is the one I wanted to say for the second half of the class. Who wrote James? And if you say James, I'm going to ask you, Nathan, to leave. Probably Jesus' brother, exactly. I knew Nathan was about to say James. That's why I had to say that. Let me ask you this. Which James is it? How many James do you see in Scripture, in the New Testament? 3. Does anybody else have a different answer? Not 4. Bill, we're doing Price is Right numbers. Yeah. Yes. James, son of Alphaeus is 1. Yes. There's actually 5. There could be 4. I don't know if Jeff actually knew that or if he was just throwing that out. I don't know if he just knew that 3 wasn't thrown, so we could go 4. There's actually 5. If you look at Scripture, they're all represented in Scripture to various degrees. James, the brother of Jesus, who we'll discuss at length here in a second. But James, the brother of Jesus, is one of them. James, the brother of John. This is the brother of the sons of thunder that Jesus describes. So James is a very impactful Scripture or person in Scripture, very understated as well. I wish we had more information about him. But you also have James, the son of Alphaeus, who as Linda mentioned, and then there's James, the son of Mary. And there's thoughts about whether or not James, the son of Mary, is the same as James, the son of Alphaeus. I don't know. I try not to get too far deep down this rabbit hole because you could look at this for years if you wanted to. James, the son of Mary, is always referenced in relationship to his mom. So whether or not it's the same as James, the son of Alphaeus, I don't know. But then there's also this James, who is the father of Judas, which imagine that's your claim to fame, is that you are literally the father of the guy who betrayed Jesus. It's probably not him, if you want to be honest. James, the father of Judas, doesn't show up more than I think twice in the entire book of Scripture. James, the son of Mary, might be it. If it is, then there's nothing really known about him. If it's James, the son of Alphaeus, it could be him. The other one is James, the brother of John. James, the son of Alphaeus, and James, the brother of John, are both apostles, and that's important for the authorship. Why? If you're trying to determine authorship, and these 2 guys are apostles, the son of Alphaeus and the brother of John, why is it probably not them?
More likely they would say that they're apostles.
Exactly. Yeah.
Paul did, Peter did.
Right. And Paul did in large part because, now obviously he's just part of the salutation, but also because there were credibility issues. People were saying,
He became an apostle in a different way.
that's true, yeah. But also people were like, well, is Paul really an apostle? I'm not for sure. So Paul did a lot for credibility, but you're right, he probably would have stated it. In James chapter 1 and verse 1, how does he describe himself? He describes himself as a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ to the 12 tribes who were dispersed abroad. If he was an apostle, he more likely would have probably described himself as such. I think that's just reasonable to conclude. Of course, it may be him. We just don't know. When was James the brother of John? What happened to him in Scripture? No. That was, if he was a Roman citizen, he would have been beheaded, yeah. I think he was just killed with the sword. I think that's what Acts chapter 12 talks about. Acts chapter 12 verse 1 is when Herod kills him and then tries to kill Peter also. The miracle happens that kind of makes Peter escape. What's that?
Which Herod? Which Herod are you referencing?
The one in Acts chapter 12 verse 1. Why would you do that to me?
Because you do it to us.
I don't do it to you. I don't know. I want to say Agrippa because there's like a 2 out of 4 chance of that being Agrippa, but I think it's probably, you know what, we're just going to move on because I know exactly why you asked that question. It's just rude of you. So, anyways, James the brother of John, that's a good question. It's Acts chapter 12 verse 1, you can look at that more. But if it was James the brother of John, an apostle of Jesus, probably would have identified himself as such. Why is it interesting that it could be James, brother of Jesus? And this is as much as you can get in the scholarly world about authorship. This is one of those that a lot of people agree on. Why is it interesting that it's James, the brother of Jesus? Or let me ask you this, who is James, the brother of Jesus?
Was he prominent walking in the church?
That's exactly what it was, right. He was prominent in the church of Jerusalem. Why do you say that? Or why would she say that? Anybody can answer that. Acts 15, exactly. If you look at Acts chapter 15, who speaks? You have Paul and Barnabas, or Paul and Silas talking, and you have Peter talking, and then who do you have? James, exactly. What does James say? James commands most of the literature in Acts chapter 15. What does James say?
This passage in the Old Testament is talking about it's just now fulfilled in your sight. So,
right.
It is my understanding that we do not forbid the Gentiles, but instruct them. Right.
We need to instruct him. This is not something that we need to keep from them, that the Gentiles have a place, and he brings up the Old Testament in regards to that. He also appears in Galatians chapter 2. We're going to jump around quite a bit here. Look in Galatians chapter 2.
The Jews from James.
I'm sorry?
The Jews from James.
Okay, you don't have to give away it, but yes, that is where we're going. Look in Galatians chapter 2. I almost just shoot, but that would have been me pulling a job. That's a good question. I just don't have the answer off the top of my head. Galatians 2 is the big chapter that talks about Peter and Paul and the whole confrontation. But all this starts because the people come from a certain individual. In Galatians chapter 2, starting verse 11, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. Who are these men that came from James that got Peter all befuddled? Who are these men from James? They're Jews for sure, right? Who are these men from James? Is there any more to them than that? Probably would have been people that he was teaching, which begs the question then, is part of this James's fault? And I don't think so. I think when you look at the text, there's nothing to indicate that this is James's fault. But what it does reveal to you about James is what? As Lyndon kind of mentioned in terms of his authority, what does it reveal to you?
Well, if you're coming from Jerusalem and you're a Christian and a Jew, you're associated with being from James, or
right.
That James somehow had some kind of authority over you.
Right. If you're coming from James, or if you're coming from Jerusalem, that's more or less kind of what he's talking about here in Galatians 2, that you come from James. But if that's the reputation you have, that you're a man coming from James, but you're really just kind of coming from Jerusalem, it says a lot about James, that he has so much authority and so much respect within this town, that these are people that are identified with him rather than maybe the city of Jerusalem. And that says a lot about who James is. It's also noteworthy that when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and the list of people that Jesus appears to, who does he appear to? He appears to the apostles, then he appears to 500, and then who does he appear to? He appears to James, exactly. When you look at Acts chapter 21, we didn't discuss this in our Acts class, but when you look at Acts chapter 21, verses 17 through 19, who's the first person that Paul sees when he gets to Jerusalem? James, exactly. Why does James keep inserting himself into this dialogue? Why does he keep popping up? He seems to be strong, yeah. Right, go ahead. Right. 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 Full speed, which by the way, the writer of the Epistle of Jude qualifies himself as James's brother. So it could very well be that he's talking about not only James being a brother of Jesus, but Jude, who wrote that epistle, also being a brother of Jesus. That's up for debate also. But you're right. I mean, James was obviously not following Jesus at first. Why? How do you know that?
Because every prophet is rejected by
That's true. Every prophet is rejected by their own country, for sure.
Well, the gospel narrative confirms that he did not believe, neither did any of his family that we know of, except for Mary. We are never given an indication that she denied or doubted that Jesus was who he said he was.
Right, and even Mary herself. I mean, Mary obviously believed. You can see that in John 2 with the miracle at Cana with turning water to wine. But I think John mentioned specifically that none of his brothers had believed, and I think that's what Zach's talking about. Look at John chapter 7, though. Usually when we talk about the brothers of Jesus, we bring up that one isolated verse that none of his brothers believed, and that's accurate. But John chapter 7 points kind of a different viewpoint of these brothers of Jesus. In John chapter 7, starting in verse 1, it says, "After these things Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him." He knew the Jews were trying to kill him. Probably everybody knew the Jews were trying to kill him. Now the feast of the Jews, the feast of booths, was near. Therefore his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go into Judea, so that your disciples may also see your works which you are doing." Where does his brothers want him to go? Where do his brothers want him to go? Judea, exactly. Why is that noteworthy, according to the first two verses? Jesus doesn't want to go to Judea because he knows the Jews are trying to kill him. His brothers say what? In verse 3. Why don't you just go to Judea? Right. And listen to the rationale. Verse 3. Leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples also may see your works which you're doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, then show yourself to the world. For not even, verse 5, his brothers were believing in him. So Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come." Your time is always opportune. I love how the older brother kind of puts that on the other brothers. "The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its deeds are evil. Go up to the feast yourselves. I do not go up to this feast because my time has not yet fully come." And having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. What do his apostles want him to do?
His apostles or brothers?
I'm sorry, what do his brothers want him to do?
Go to the feast. If you are who you say you are.
Right. If you truly are the Son of God, then go into Judea and go into Judea and make yourself known to everybody. Because no one does these things in secret. Everybody needs to see who you are. Jesus retorts with what? It's not my time, but what? I love this little step. It's always your time to believe, exactly. That's why 1 Corinthians 15 is so important. When Jesus appears after his resurrection, he shows himself to all the apostles, then he shows himself to the 500, he shows himself to Peter by himself, but he also shows himself to James. What does that mean for the life of James? Whereas usually he was not only disbelieving, but probably antagonistic towards Jesus. What is he now?
Change his mind.
He changed everything about his mind, exactly. And I think that's why when you look at James 1 and verse 1, he doesn't talk about himself as being a brother of Jesus. That would have been, given him a whole different measure of respect that maybe he didn't feel he was worthy of. But he says, "I'm a bondservant of Jesus because maybe I'm not worthy to be called, the brother of Jesus." There's a little bit of a lack of kind of whatever they're going through. So I think John chapter 7 kind of paints a different picture of it. Somebody else have any thoughts or comments about that?
It's worth noting that in Acts 1 verse 14, that Mary and all of Jesus' brothers are mentioned there.
Right.
Being in that upper room. So that would have been probably immediately following that appearance to James, where you find that he's right there at the
Right.
cross.
Once he saw the risen Jesus, once he saw his risen brother, everything about his life turned. And that shows everything about the power of the resurrection. When we say that the resurrection is the single most important miracle that Jesus ever did, it's because of stuff like this. James was completely antagonistic towards his brother. And yet once he saw the risen Jesus, that's when everything in his life changed. And that's when everything in everybody's life would change. He also mentions in James chapter 1, by the way, you'll run into people who will believe that the James here that's talking about is not James, the brother of Jesus, but that James is the son of Alphaeus. Most of the people that you'll talk to that believe that are Catholics because of the nature of the quote-unquote perpetual virginity of Jesus, or perpetual virginity of Mary. They don't believe that Mary ever had any other children. And so primarily Catholics will tell you that the James that wrote this book was James the son of Alphaeus, and that's the 99% reason why they say that. That's the conversation we're talking about. Yeah?
You know what's interesting about that? When Jesus is out healing, and he's in the town, and his mother and his brothers and sisters come to take him because they think he's crazy.
Right.
But yet the Catholics will say, Mary never had any other kid.
Yeah. I don't know if it's because they thought he was crazy. I know they wanted to talk to him at one point. I think that may be what you're talking about. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how you get around the idea of the brothers. What they'll argue is that brothers means cousins. I know I've heard of people that will say that.
Yeah.
I've heard of other people that will say, well, it's brothers by, maybe adopted brothers from Joseph. Joseph had another relationship, and that's where those brothers come from. But you have to do a lot of manipulation to get around that part, and that's the unfortunate side of it. Yes?
Just going back to your comment about James and changing his mentality, obviously looking at the book of James, just because he didn't necessarily believe that Jesus was who he said he was, you can tell from James's book, the way he wrote it, that he was paying attention to what Jesus was saying.
Right.
It wasn't like he was completely disregarding everything Jesus was saying. He was listening, and he was paying attention. It just didn't sink in with him to be the truth until he got to that point.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good application for us in the way we evangelize, and that people watch what you say, and people listen to what you say, and just because it doesn't appear to you that it's making any sense to them, at some point the light may switch on, and so to give up and be like, well, it's not doing any good, so I might as well give up. Just keep pressing on, because you never know what the trigger may be that helps that person remember the things that you've said, or the way that you've acted, and the way you've lived your life, that may turn them around and say, okay, he knows what he's talking about. Maybe he was right. Maybe I do need to make a change.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent point. I hadn't even thought of that, but that's true. I mean, his familiarity with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, with his teachings as reflected throughout the course of the book of James, shows that he was paying attention. That even if he didn't believe, he at least was there. And John 7 shows that there was at least some relationship that Jesus had with his brothers. But because of that, we tend to look at these guys as one-dimensional. We say either he didn't believe and then he believed, and there's no middle ground between that. But you're exactly right. Even in that period of disbelief, he was still listening to what Jesus had to say, still internalizing it, even if he hadn't made that step yet. So that's a good point. Okay, when he also mentions in James chapter 1, kind of gives the audience not only about himself, but he also gives the audience. He says, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. You wouldn't think that that phrase would evoke so much confusion, but it has. Who is James addressing his letter to? If he is writing from Jerusalem, as we tend to think that he is, if he's writing from Jerusalem and he talks to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, who do we think he's talking to? Probably Jewish Christians, exactly. There's three primary questions that come up whenever you look at this and you talk about this with people. Number one, the first question is he addressing Jews or Gentiles? The second question is he addressing Jews in a metaphorical sense or a literal sense? And then people will ask, is he talking to people that are abroad, or is he talking to people that are in Jerusalem? You would think that the text in James 1:1 kind of gives that all away right away, but it's obvious to me when you look at this that he talks not to Gentiles, but primarily to Jews. Why is it that James's letter is primarily addressed to Jews? And why would you think that?
That's where he came from.
It's where he came from, right. He's a Jew, he's in Jerusalem, right.
He evidently carried a whole lot of authority with, if this is James, the brother of Christ, he's going to carry a whole lot of weight with the Jewish population, regardless of where they were, where they came from. So he's, by writing to them, he is playing his cards in the most strategic way possible.
Right, and that does reflect on James's writing. I mean, he is a person who obviously has enormous authority or enormous respect, but he's also being, as I mentioned, very strategic about what he says. And when you look at James, there's a lot of references. That's why we mentioned the Shema earlier, the royal law. There's references every once in a while to this idea of the Old Testament that he kind of brings into fulfillment. And the references that he makes, the idea in James chapter 2, not only to Abraham, but also to Rahab, those are people that these would have been familiar with. So he references them. It's probably not his identification as the brother of Jesus that gives him credit as much as the fact that he's a Jew operating from Jerusalem. There's a whole bunch of connotations to the fact that the people who were abroad were kind of the less than holy Jews as opposed to the ones who actually stayed in Jerusalem. So for that reason, it's probably not just talking about literal Jews as much as it is metaphorical. Now Paul makes this distinction in Romans chapter 2 when he talks about circumcision. What does he talk about when he says circumcision? Circumcision of the flesh is not really what matters. For what? Circumcision of the heart, exactly. Being a Jew in the body doesn't matter as much as being a Jew in a metaphorical sense in your devotion towards God. And so when he says to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, he's not just talking about the Jews, he's talking about Messianic Jews, he's talking probably in a kind of an disattached way to the Gentiles. But if you remember in Paul's speech in Acts chapter 26, he says that he is standing on trial for the hope of the Jews, the hope of the 12 tribes. That's not just a Jewish thing, who is it for? For everybody, exactly. Jew, Gentile, no matter who you are. But it's a very distinctly Jewish hope. That's kind of what he's addressing. But it applies to Messianic Jews. It applies to anybody who names the name of Christ or is attached to God. And I think he's very specifically talking to people who are abroad. He's probably there addressing the Jews that are in Jerusalem, kind of person to person. But this is the letter that he has to other people. And his whole goal, as we talked about is this idea of perseverance. Why is a Jew writing from Jerusalem talking about perseverance? What happened in Jerusalem? Great persecution. Now, which one are you talking about? Persecution is a huge term. What specific aspect or what specific persecution?
Those that are of Abraham, but they're not the sons of Abraham.
Right, those who are sons of Abraham but are of Abraham but not sons of Abraham, yeah. Think about this, what big defining event in the book of Acts washed the church to all these different worlds? Right, persecution of Stephen, exactly. And there's a reference there in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, that was a great persecution to set them off. Acts chapter 11 references the great persecution of Stephen, the evangelism that happened as a result of that. And so if James is talking from Jerusalem about perseverance, he's talking about it in a very personal way. It's not as if, Stephen is killed by stoning outside the city of Jerusalem, and then all the Jews just kind of walk back in and everyone's happy and everybody gets along. What kind of world is James living in if he's based out of Jerusalem?
Secrecy and fear.
Secrecy and fear, you can see that in once again, Acts chapter 12, my favorite chapter. Acts chapter 12, where Peter is held on trial and has to enter into a house, the house where they're staying, where Rhoda is there, the servant girl who sees Peter. My memory is awful right now. They're operating in secret, they're praying in secret, yeah. What other type of environment is this?
We're now before the destruction of Jerusalem.
We're absolutely before the destruction of
There's
Jerusalem.
probably lots of politics things going on.
Right.
And even more against the Jews and against the Christians.
Right. Which if you remember from our Acts class, the pressure on the Jews, or pressure on the Christian, was not just because the Jews viewed them as being blasphemous, but the Jews were also very volatile people. So they had pressure from the Romans to kind of keep things in check. Jerusalem is the epicenter of that. And so the persecution of the Jews towards the Christians was in large part because they're trying to keep the peace and trying to save face with the Romans. And the Christians are in Jerusalem, are at the front of this, they're at ground zero. It's a very tumultuous time. So when James is writing about perseverance, he's not writing about it in abstract form. He's writing about it because he's going through it right now. And so the things that he says about perseverance matter to us. For instance, he talks about why to survive. What's the purpose? Not just surviving, but why you're persevering, why you're pushing through this, how to live. It's only really occurred to me in this latest reading that he's not talking about perseverance in a sense of just kind of sitting and waiting for it to go by you. He's talking about thriving in the midst of persecution. That's a strong theme in his letter. He also talks about how to grow through that. We mentioned that a second ago, and who to lean on. That's how James 5 kind of builds. Not only do you lean on God, but you also lean on each other. That's, to me, the backbone of why he has so much material out there. Do we have any thoughts or comments on that?
In our previous slide, we talked about the audience.
Right.
But it's amazing how relevant this letter is to us.
Right. Yes.
It's you're not kind of really addressing the Jews and the Christians, but
right.
there's still things we deal with that.
All of us need to persevere. It may not look like that, but the same principles about perseverance still apply to us. I think that's exactly right. Yeah. If there's nothing else, we'll pick up in 2 weeks. At the end of the quarter, we're going to do another overview. We're going to kind of discuss it, and then we'll finish it. Thank you, everybody.